Hello everyone, welcome to another feature here from me today, and today we are covering the Resident Evil series. You know what, with the Resident Evil 6 hitting stores later this year, I think it's a bit fitting to revisit the franchise and have a look back at some of the games that made the Resident Evil name a popular one. So, when we think back to the Resident Evil series, we remember a simple mansion exploration in the first game to ass-kicking in Africa in the last game, or Resident Evil 5. So, enough about that. Here I'm going to be listing my top Resident Evil games, my personal choice, in preparation for Resident Evil 6, and I hope in the future, as more Resident Evil games come, because I hope there will be more, I will be adding to this list as soon as I play them. So anyway, let's start off with this series. There should be a spoiler notice. There may be some spoilers in this, and this may be a shorter feature because I'm learning from my Dark Souls earlier one that might have been a bit too long, so I want to keep things short. But we start off with number 7, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. So we start off with Nemesis, the third game in the Resident Evil series. And the most memorable thing about this game was the inclusion of Nemesis himself, a giant tyrant-like monster that had a rocket launcher on his freaking arm. And he will be chasing you around as you explored the Raccoon City, because Resident Evil 3 took place in Raccoon City. You played as Jill Valentine for most of the game, and you basically were trying to escape from Raccoon City. It takes place about 24 hours before the events of Resident Evil 2 and 24 hours after. And it's also, a lot of people point out that Resident Evil 4 was the first title in the Resident Evil universe to feature action or to embrace the action genre. But if you think about it, Resident Evil 3 already took a small step in that direction anyway, because you had, not only the chase sequences with Nemesis, but you also had the ability to dodge attacks in the game, and you could also quickly turn 180 degrees, which was new at the time. So, all these things already made it into an action game. And for me, overall, Resident Evil 3 wasn't all that memorable. It was the third game in the series. The sort of gameplay and puzzles were getting a bit old and tired by then. I know they tried to mix it up, but it didn't really work all that well. It wasn't as bad as Resident Evil 1 or 2, so that kind of, doesn't give you a lot of memorable moments as those two first games did. But it's still a decent entry in the series. And we move on to number 6. Resident Evil 0. So Resident Evil 0 first came out for the GameCube and basically told the story of events before Resident Evil 1. I think it was like 24 hours before, and it focused on Rebecca Chambers, one of the STARS Bravo team members, as she went on about her business before entering the mansion. So this game provided, it was Capcom's way of, providing a bit more in-depth look into the Umbrella Corporation and the backstory behind how Resident Evil 1 came about in the first place. And so, from a story perspective, it's decent, but as a gaming overall perspective, it wasn't all that memorable either. Sure, it had its moments and the graphics were good, but overall it wasn't the best of the games. Moving on to number 5. Resident Evil 5. This may surprise some that I've placed Resident Evil 5 this high in the list. I know a lot of people don't like the game because it's very action heavy, and it also has a ridiculous depiction of fan favorites Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, so Capcom managed to annoy a lot of people with that. But the most important thing to me about this game, why I like it to a certain degree, is the co-op mechanics in the game. To me, Resident Evil 5 was still one of the best co-op experiences of this generation. It was hella fun. I know it was action heavy, but it still had a few horror moments here and there. I remember particularly when I was playing with my friend, we were in a swamp-like area, and he ran on ahead in front of me, and then I saw something in the water, moving towards him, and as soon as I realized it was an alligator, I screamed at him, and then we all started running haywire all over the place. But it's still a really fun game. I know in terms of an action game more than a survival horror game, but it should still count. But, we're still not the best game in the series. And we move on to number 4, Resident Evil Code Veronica. So, I know Code Veronica is probably one of the best games in the series, simply because of the atmosphere that surrounds the game. It still used the old school camera and controls of the, earlier games, so all the pros and cons of that if you see it that way. But, one of the best parts is the whole atmosphere of the game, interesting setting and plot that is tied together with a good degree of survival horror mechanics. So you start the game as Claire Redfield again, who we first met in Resident Evil 2. And you have to find a way to escape from, first off, a military base, which also features this mansion that is owned by this dude known as, he's part of the Ashford family. And then as you learn more about the Ashford family and their twisted relationships, you start to sense a degree of, the creepy atmosphere in the game. So in the second half of the game, you play as Chris Redfield, and the primary downside with this game is that there's a lot of backtracking in the game anyway. So when you begin the game as Claire Redfield, you still have a lot of backtracking. Then you begin as Chris Redfield. The second part of the game, you go back through basically the same stuff that Claire did in the same areas, so that's kind of, annoying and boring. Now we head to the top 3 games in the series, and we start off with Resident Evil 1, and I'm combining this together with Resident Evil Remake for the GameCube. So this is the original game that brought many people into not only the Resident Evil universe, but also the survival horror universe. So it's a simple plot where the Special Tactics and Rescue Service Team, Alpha Team, members go out to investigate the disappearance of the Bravo Team, who were themselves investigating a series of murders on the Arklay Mountains, which is where the mansion is. So, who knew that, running into this abandoned mansion would bring forth this, would first have all these gruesome monsters in it, and expose this huge plot about, this company that was trying to develop bio-terrorist weapons. So the best part about this game is that it, being the first game in the series, it has a lot of memorable moments. Who can forget the first sight of your first zombie in the game, hunching over, doing something on the ground. We learn that he's actually eating someone, but we don't know at the time. Then we see him, and then he slowly turns his head to look at us, and then we see that it's a zombie, and it's so freaking amazing. That moment is still clear in my head, the first time I saw that. And then you have all these other, monsters in the game. You've got, a lot of it is based on mutant wildlife like snakes, spiders, and even plants. But it also features one of my favorite monsters in the Resident Evil games, which are hunters, because I just love the fact that you start off the game with zombies predominantly who are slow, and you can easily either avoid them or shoot them, and then you suddenly get faced with hunters in the sort of like second half of the game, and that's just a whole change up in how you have to deal with the situation you're in. I love that. And I should note that, you could play as either Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, but the progress through the story or the gameplay progress was more or less the same. The story was a bit different for each character, and Jill's path through the game was a bit easier than Chris's, but overall, I think there was enough variety to, want to play as both. So that's why, I think it definitely deserves a place in the fans' hearts, in my hearts basically, because I really love the game, and I, even the, supposed cons of the series, the clunky controls, the awkward cameras, and the cheesy dialogue, you just grew to like all of that. And we move on to the number 2 game in the series, and this was a tough one. It was tough to decide between this number 2 and number 1, but in the end I went with Resident Evil 2 for my number 2 game. So you guys should be able to guess which game is at number 1. But I have to say that while Resident Evil 2 didn't top this list, don't take that as a sign of it being inadequate in some way or form. On the contrary, Resident Evil 2 certainly has some aspects going for it that at times make it better than the number 1 game, but I think the overall package can't quite beat the top game in this list. So where Resident Evil 1 brought fans to the Resident Evil universe, Resident Evil 2 made them stay. So, sequels tend to have a lot to live up to, but, Resident Evil 2 delivered. The plot follows Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the first time we meet these two characters, as they enter Raccoon City, only to find that the city has been turned into a zombie-infested nightmare. So, in comparison to the first game, which was just a localized area of infection, this was a whole city. Things were getting, really out of hand by now. And it was also a bit easier to connect to Leon and Claire because they didn't have special training of any form, whereas Jill and Chris had, they were part of the Special Tactics and Rescue team. So, even though they hadn't faced zombies, they had some level of special training. Whereas Claire and Leon didn't. Leon was a rookie zombie, was a rookie cop. And Claire was just, a biker chick or something. So, it was easier to connect to them. Plus, I think the best part of the game was that, it had a really decent story, It wasn't the best story ever in gaming, but, the plot really progressed really well from the beginning of the game until the end. Probably the best plot progression in any of the Resident Evil games. And I think one of the reasons for that is because I remember reading up, how, there's this game called, or this alpha version of Resident Evil 2 known as Resident Evil 1.5, which was a really different experience. It was already like 60 to 80% complete, but they decided to can it because they weren't, the developers, the head of developer at Capcom wasn't, happy with it. So he ended up bringing in a writer, a novelist or something like that, to help pen the story, and it gave it a bit more life. And I think you can see that really in the sort of the plot of the game, the side characters in the game. They really sort of they add spice to the game overall, more so than in Resident Evil 1. And the other thing I should mention is that one of the other nice aspects about the game is that first off, you could play as either Claire or Leon to begin with, but if you played, say, as Claire at first, once you finish her playthrough, you can start as Leon, but seeing things from his perspective while Claire was going through that first playthrough, because Claire and Leon split up at the beginning of the game. So if you play as Claire first, you can play things on your next playthrough as Leon, going through a different path in the story, his versions of things while Claire was doing the original stuff. Of course, you can start off as Claire as Leon to begin with, and then follow up with Claire. So you basically had 4 kind of different playthroughs. There was a lot of similarities, but there were some differences that made it fun to play all 4 playthroughs, and it wasn't really a chore to do so. So I really did like this game. It brings back a lot of good memories. Like the first game, there was still a lot of memorable moments, like fighting this giant alligator in the sewers, so it does have a lot going for it. And it was one of my favorite games that I played growing up, and it like Resident Evil 1, it shares a small place in my heart for the Resident Evil series. A big place. This is one of the best games I've played. And at number 1 we have Resident Evil 4. I guess you could have guessed that from the way I made this list. We've finally reached the number 1 game I feel for the Resident Evil series, and it's Resident Evil 4, which sort of turned the series on its head, and it hasn't looked back since. So we were reintroduced to Leon Kennedy, a bit more mature and a bit more experienced, which we'd come to expect given how he'd handled Resident Evil 2. And this time he works for the Secret Service, and in this game he's trying to find the American president's daughter, Ashley. So he finds himself way out in a remote village in Spain, some random reason. But it's kind of similar to Raccoon City because that village has been turned into an infected zone. So everyone there has been infected, not by a virus, but by a parasite, which doesn't turn people into zombies, but still sort of keeps their humanoid features, but makes them all sort of be extra aggressive to outsiders, and they only follow sort of the leaders of their group. It's based on a hierarchy system, and at the top of that was your ultimate final boss enemy, and everyone basically had to follow the leader and what he wanted. It was sort of like a form of mind control for this religious cult, basically. It was a pretty freaky backstory to it. I think the dialogue in the game was still pretty cheesy, and the characters, some of them were good, some of them weren't. They didn't really flash out a lot of the backstory with the characters. So they weren't the best of side characters, like say for instance Resident Evil 2. The side characters were really interesting. In this game, they were interesting, but they just didn't flesh them out all that well. But the atmosphere was still creepy, and the infection in this game was known as the Las Plagas, and it meant that you stumbled across various humanoid and non-humanoid foes. But there was still a lot of memorable moments, especially boss fights in the game. You had the monster in the lake, and you also had like the El Gigante, really interesting fights basically, especially in the Resident Evil universe, because they were kind of new as well. But of course, the main thing about this game that speaks of its awesomeness is the gameplay. I know it's more action oriented than previous titles, but it still manages to include a lot of, or a good amount of horror elements. Maybe not specifically survival horror, but I think it's still a good representation. I think the gameplay mechanics aren't bad for a survival horror game. It's just that balance that Capcom needs to find, really, which they haven't really truly replicated. I mean, if it wasn't perfect in Resident Evil 4, it's definitely not perfect in 5. So I do think that Resident Evil 4 is one of the best games in the Resident Evil universe. A lot of people have it as one of their best games ever, which I think is fair enough. I think any of the top 3 games, Resident Evil 1 or Remake, Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 4, if you had one of those as your favorite Resident Evil games, I think that's fair enough comment. I think a lot of people like those games a lot. So there you have it, folks, my list of the top Resident Evil games. Hope you enjoyed that. If you have differing opinions, write it in the list or in the comment section below. Give us your list. I like to see what you guys think. And I just want to touch briefly upon Resident Evil 6. I haven't really seen much of the gameplay. I know a lot of people are a bit negative about it, some positive, some negatives here and there. I don't really want to see a lot of it because a lot of that is kind of spoilerish. I just want to experience the game when it comes out. Having said that, I'll still look to reviews if, well, it depends on my mood. What other games are around. I might get it straight away, or I might get it later. If I do get it, I hope to update this list with how I would rank the Resident Evil 6, and how, if I don't give a full review of it, at least I'd be able to compare it to the other games. And that's my hope with these features like this. So even if there ever is a Resident Evil 7 or 8 or so on, I like to add it to the list and see where it stacks up to the past. But anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, give us a shout out, give us a comment if you have differing opinions, or if you even have similar opinions. I enjoyed making this list. Hope you enjoyed it too. Thanks for watching. See you later.